Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Chris Hemsworth is back as the Huntsman fighting a winter's war against sisters Charlize Theron and Emily Blunt. After the defeat of evil Queen Ravenna, played by Charlize Theron at the end of Snow White and the Huntsman, Eric, played by Chris Hemsworth, is assigned the task of finding and destroying Ravenna's magic mirror, whose dark magic corrupts all who look upon it, and has mysteriously disappeared while being transported from Snow's palace. Eric must prevent it from falling into the wrong hands of Ravenna's sister Freya, played by Emily Blunt, the Ice Queen who rules the North, and on his journey rediscovers his long-lost love Sarah, played by Jessica Chastain, who Eric believed was dead. Cast your mind back to 2012 and you might remember the battle between the two Snow White movies. On the one hand you had Mirror Mirror, and on the other you had Snow White and the Huntsman, the gritty and moody take on the fairy tale that was a huge hit back in that year, and was very much the victor of that particular argument. Even still, it doesn't appear to have had much cultural significance. It doesn't seem to have stuck around very well. And I can tell it didn't stick around very well in my mind because I had to re-watch the first film before I went and saw this follow-up, because even though I saw the original back on its theatrical run, I couldn't tell you anything about it. And there's a reason for that. It's because on a visual level it's stunning, but on a story level it's bland and completely uninteresting. And that's likely why it hasn't had very much cultural staying power apart from Charlize Theron's evil queen. Of course, because it was a huge hit, we now have this follow-up. One of the few things that people might remember about Snow White and the Huntsman more than the actual movie was the controversy regarding the fact that its star, Kristen Stewart, had an affair with its director. And there was a lot of hoo-ha about that and whether they would be returning for the sequel. And of course it's been retooled so that it's more about Chris Hemsworth's Huntsman rather than Snow White. And so neither the original director or the star of the first film reappear in this one. Although Snow is actually in this movie really awkwardly. She's very briefly in it, played by a body double, shot from behind. Snow doesn't participate in this adventure because she's ill, which is code word for she's gone a bit mad because the evil mirror has made her kill a couple of guards. So much for the fairest of them all. That is a very quick scene that almost seems like a take that to Stewart. There seems to be a couple of moments in this movie that seem to take shots at Snow White's expense that seem really awkward when you understand the circumstances of why she hasn't returned to this movie. If you've seen the advertising for this movie, then you'll probably know they really, really want you to think this is a Disney movie. That if you've seen all the posters and the trailers, they keep saying, from the producer of Maleficent. And that's not coincidental because they're massively ripping off Frozen. It is so blatant. You can almost feel the Universal executives rubbing their hands together when they realise that Hans Christian Andersen's Snow Queen is public domain, so they can use that character. And I mean, it is exact. When we see Freya's Ice Palace, I laugh. The big spire there looks exactly like Frozen. The way that Emily Blunt is in this movie looks exactly like Elsa in Frozen. Even her name, Elsa, Freya, they just looked for another name that sounded vaguely like Elsa and they settled on Freya. Here's the thing, the character of Freya is not a very interesting one. Emily Blunt is a really great actress. She's playing the Ice Queen, so of course she's this very cold, very brutal character, but at the same time we're meant to understand that she's meant to have this very tragic side to her. Underneath it all, she does have a heart, she does have some sympathy as much as she tries to shield herself behind it. We're given this backstory in the opening minutes about how she had a baby and her lover killed it in a fire, which causes her powers that were previously dormant to emerge, and she kills him and she becomes the Ice Queen, and she tries to get over her absence from her child by kidnapping all the children in her kingdom and turning them into soldiers. She turns them into the Huntsman. So this is how we get Eric and Sarah, the two leads of our movie, and this is how we get their backstory. I would like to add that this is a very severe retcon to the first movie because Freya is Ravenna's sister, completely unmentioned in the previous film, although funnily enough, Ravenna had a brother in Snow White and the Huntsman that is totally absent in this movie, not even mentioned, not even in the flashback sections. But there's nothing for Blunt to play with because she's not an effective antagonist, there's nothing to really root for. She ends up being a very bland character because she is so cold and so closed off. It plays against Blunt's strengths as an actress, despite the fact that she was probably attracted by the tragic elements of the character. And that's probably why they brought in Charlize Theron again. They managed to Spock her way back into the movie. And she is the best thing in this movie again. She easily steals the show from Blunt, and she is loving every second of being back as this character, as well she should be. But she's not in the movie for very long. And going back to the film's advertising, you might be confused why I'm referring to it as being both a prequel and a sequel, because the advertising has very much said, see the story before Snow White. That's a lie. The entire storyline that the marketing has been portraying, that there's this sibling rivalry between the two kingdoms, that Ravenna and Freya rule, and the Huntsman and Sarah are caught in this Winter's War. That's not the plot of the movie. Winter's War, the subtitle, doesn't even make sense in the context of the movie unless you were to count some battle scenes in the first half. What it actually is both prequel and sequel. The first 25 to 30 minutes are narrated by Liam Neeson. I know, I was surprised as well. And he tells us this backstory, of course, of Ravenna, Freya, Eric, and Sarah that leads into the main adventure of the movie, which is a direct follow-up to Snow White and the Huntsman. It takes place maybe days after the first movie. So if you're going to see this movie, I think it's very important to know that you have been lied to. And the reason they've lied to you is because Charlize Theron is not in this movie for very long. She appears in the first 5 minutes and then doesn't reappear again until the final half hour of the movie. She's not the main antagonist of this movie for the most part. That's Emily Blunt's Freya. And it's so misleading that I almost have to tell you this as a sort of public service. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't even tell you that Charlize Theron returns as Ravenna because it happens so late into this 2-hour movie that I would normally consider it a spoiler if she wasn't all over the marketing campaign. Although I actually kind of like this movie a little bit more than Snow White and the Huntsman. For one major reason, it is much lighter in tone. If you rewatch the first film, it has this very dreary, very grey and bleak colour scheme, and it takes itself very seriously. It's very portentous and very kind of sluggish and dreary to get through. I found it a bit of a slog to rewatch it directly before this movie. But even still, this one has a marked improvement because it's a lot more colourful. It's set after Snow White and the Huntsman, so it's in this world that's sort of rejuvenating, and it's actually a much more interesting world to wander around in. But what also helps is that the shackles have come off Chris Hemsworth, because he doesn't have to play this drunken widower who's very moody and grouchy that he was playing in the first film. Because we've retconned it so that the love of his life has somehow survived, suddenly he becomes a much lighter character. And it's a significant improvement for it, because it plays very much to Hemsworth's strengths. I think that Hemsworth is best when he plays these cocky, very bravado-filled characters. It's what he's best at. And he's given the chance to really shine in this movie. He's given a chance to play the action hero. And Hemsworth is very good at that particular role. And he has a lot of fun with this movie. You can tell that he's really enjoying himself getting into this fantasy adventure. And the same actually goes for Jessica Chastain. And I enjoyed her character of Sarah, the sort of female huntsman character. And the scenes that they have together, they work quite well. They do have a genuine chemistry, which makes up for the fact they both have terrible accents. Their accents are atrocious. I think they're attempting to be Scottish. Chastain has it worse because she's American, whereas Hemsworth gets about 10 minutes into the movie and decides, oh no, I'm just apparently vacationing to Australia now. It also helps that the film is much lighter in tone because we now have the dwarves full time, because if you remember, Snow White and the Huntsman took a lot of time trying to introduce the dwarf characters. It wasn't until about an hour in. But here they're sidekicks throughout the entire journey. The only one to return from the original film is Nick Frost. And he's brought back with a new character, his brother, played by British comedian Rob Brydon. And we're also introduced to these female dwarves, played by Sheridan Smith and Alexandra Roach. And they get a lot of funny lines, and they get to do a lot of funny bits. And I was sort of mixed on those characters. The female dwarves are amusing, but there's a lot of jokes at the expense of their appearance. If anyone's really the problem, it's Rob Brydon. Brydon can be amusing, but he's leaned on so much for humour, he becomes a little bit annoying because his character doesn't contribute very much to the story, other than to do jokes. The film is directed by Cedric Nicholas Troyan, who was the second unit director and the visual effects supervisor on the original Snow White and the Huntsman. He was actually nominated for an Oscar for his role in that movie. And what he does is that he, on a visual level, extends the world of the movie out very naturally. There's a lot of recurring elements from the first film, but it looks in some ways better than the original film because it's more brighter and more colourful, and there's a lot more scope in sort of the landscapes. We get to explore a lot more of the world. On a visual level, he does the world building very well, but on a story and acting level, he doesn't seem to understand it very much. It's, again, a movie typically directed by someone who works in effects, where it seems like everything has been staged for the maximum effect in terms of costume and visuals, but never much at the actual narrative, and it leaves the actors feeling stranded. It feels like at times they're being navigated for the best possible effect shots. But I will say, because he adds that lighter tone, this did remind me a lot of the sort of fantasy movies that came out in the 80s. When I say this has a whiff of Willow about it, I mean that in the nicest possible way. I did enjoy myself, in spite of the fact that there is no reason for this to exist. But that doesn't shake the feeling that, to some extent, this does feel like a cheaper rehash of Snow White and the Huntsman, except instead of the evil queen, we have the Ice Queen. And it perhaps doesn't help that of the original cast, only 4 of them return. The other returning cast member is Sam Claflin, and he briefly comes back as Captain Exposition to tell Hemsworth that he has to find the magic mirror, and then he's gone for the rest of the movie. He is only in one scene and then he's gone. And that's one of the recurring cast members. I saw this in 3D. Now I know some people are probably confused at this point, saying, wait, this is a 3D movie? Not in the USA. For the European release, Universal converted the movie into 3D. It is an absolute waste of time. There are no 3D effects whatsoever. You are paying to wear glasses to keep the film in focus. It is one of those conversion jobs. Because 3D is still successful in Europe, there have been some films that have been converted to try and milk money out of audiences. We had this in the UK recently with The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2, but also in some European territories, Furious 7 and Noah. And this is absolutely shameless. It makes this unneeded sequel feel even more like a cash grab. Shame on you, Universal, for exploiting European audiences like this. The Huntsman Winter's War is the definition of a completely unnecessary follow-up, a weird hybrid of prequel and sequel that probably works best as a standalone adventure with only a handful of the original cast returning. It's an absolutely shameless attempt to try and cash in on the success of Frozen, and Emily Blunt's Ice Queen makes for a weak antagonist and is easily overshadowed by Charlize Theron's return as the evil queen, despite her mostly only appearing in the final act. On the plus side, it does feature a lighter tone than its predecessor, which makes it much easier to enjoy, especially since Hemsworth drops the brooding and it almost feels like an 80s fantasy flick. Unfortunately, it's lighter on story as well, with the beats being very predictable and rehashed with long lulls between set pieces, and like the first film, this is a case of pretty visuals that are very empty underneath. And shame on the price gouging 3D conversion added for the European release. Coming up soon, Dev Patel and Jeremy Irons star in the biopic The Man Who Knew Infinity, but until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.